Hi everybody, my name is Mr. Barlow. Welcome to episode 17 of the VCE Biology Podcast. This episode covers part of Unit 2, Area of Study 1, and I'll be talking about animal behaviour. So, behaviour is basically the activities of an animal that are produced in response to stimuli or a stimulus. So behaviour can involve just one animal, and in that case it's called individual behaviour, or it can involve many animals at the same time, and that's called social behaviour. Now, natural selection has actually resulted in patterns of behaviour that increase survival. So the reason that animals behave in the way that they do is that over the past tens of thousands of years and thousands of generations, those behaviours, the behaviours that animals show now have actually in the past helped that animal survive, and so they've been maintained via evolution. So if we were to put behaviour into two simple categories, we would say that there's innate behaviour and there's learned behaviour. So innate behaviour it's instinct. It happens automatically. You don't need to think about it or anything like that. It's not learned. So innate behaviours occur in response to specific stimuli called releases or sign stimuli. For example, a hen would respond to the sound of her chicks if they're in distress. So if a mother hen's chicks are in distress and they make little cheep, cheep, cheep noises, then the mother hen would automatically, she would just have an innate response, which would just be to go and help her chicks out. Another example of an innate behaviour would be maybe the way that a cat will always land on its feet. So if you've got a cat, and if you chuck it up in the air, the cat will always land on its feet. And that's just built in. The cat will always do it. It doesn't, have to think about it at all. Now, learned behaviour is behaviour which is basically modified based on previous experience. So it requires a memory. So you've got to be able to remember what you've done in the past to be able to change that behaviour in the future. Now, there are many examples of learned behaviour. To start off, there's imprinting. And this is basically when you learn about a particular stimulus during a certain stage of development. So the best example of imprinting is in young ducklings. So when young ducklings are born, they imprint on their mother, and they know that she's the animal or she's the thing who's going to care for them while they're young, and this behaviour basically helps them survive. So by hanging around their mother, that helps them survive because the mother's always going to look out for them and care for them. Another type of learned behaviour is habituation. So this is a gradual reduction of a response, and the response is usually innate as an animal becomes accustomed to it. So the innate response is reduced via learning through habituation. So an example of habituation would be, So if I do something like that, I might have scared you. Hope I did scare you. Hope you're on a bus or something and you look like a bit of an idiot. Anyway, if I do it again, ha! And again, ha! And again, ha! And again, ha! Then increasingly you're going to get less and less scared. So the first time I said it, you might have got scared, but now you're not getting scared by it anymore because you've habituated to it. You've learnt. So that's an example of habituation. Another type of learned behaviour is associative learning. So this is when an animal associates a signal with an innate response to trigger the learned behaviour. It's also known as classical conditioning. But basically, eventually, when you're just given that signal, the learned response will happen. And the best example of associative learning or classical conditioning is Pavlov's dogs. So there was this scientist called Ivan Pavlov, and he did this experiment with dogs where he gave them food and he measured the amount of saliva that they excreted. But importantly, every time he gave them food, he rang a bell. And he did this over and over and over. So he gave them food, they excreted saliva, and he rang a bell when he did it. So he gave them food, rang a bell, gave them food, rang a bell, gave them food, rang a bell. Eventually, if he just rang the bell to the dog, the dog would excrete saliva because it was expecting food. So the reason for that is the dog had associated the ringing of the bell with getting food. So that's a great classic example of associative learning. So another type of learned behaviour is trial and error learning. So this is basically when you learn from your mistakes. And the best example of this is when you put a rat in a maze or a mouse in a maze. A rat will go to a dead end, it'll learn that that's not the way out, so it'll go and try a different way, might be another dead end, learn that's not the way out, and eventually after it's tried all the ways, it'll find the exit to the maze. So that's trial and error learning. There's also observational learning, and that's basically where an animal watches another animal do something, often a member of the same species, and then learns how to do it just by observing or watching an animal do it. And then finally, in terms of types of learned behaviour, there's insight learning. So this is basically problem solving. So if an animal is presented with a problem, it won't use trial and error or one of those other learning methods. It'll just think about it, and then it'll be able to solve the problem via insight. So it just, uses its brain to think about it and solve problems. And that's the last type of learned behaviour that I'll discuss. So that's all about learned behaviour, but animals also engage in maintenance behaviours, which are basically behaviours which enable the animal to maintain their well-being and make sure they survive. So for example, animals engage in rhythmic activities. So this basically means they do the same thing in a rhythm, often over and over. A really great example of rhythmic behaviour is circadian rhythms. So circadian rhythms happen on a daily cycle. So for example, humans, which are diurnal, we go to sleep at night and we're active during the day. Some animals are nocturnal, which means they go to sleep during the day and are active at night. So they're circadian rhythms, and they're, it's one type of rhythmic behaviour. But there are also circannual rhythms, and they're basically yearly rhythms. So for example, some birds fly south during the winter to escape the cold, and they do it every year. So animals do engage in these rhythmic behaviours, which are types of maintenance behaviours. Animals also engage in behaviour which involves movement. So for example, they might move somewhere to get food or move somewhere to get shelter. They engage in feeding behaviour. So a koala might just sit up in a eucalyptus tree chewing on eucalyptus leaves. They also engage in behaviour to avoid being caught. And this is the kind of thing where they have to have a balance between feeding and not being food or avoiding being caught. So, if you don't want to get caught, you could sit hiding your whole life. But food's not going to come to you. So you've got to decide when's a good time to go and get food and when's a good time to avoid getting eaten. Animals also engage in homeostatic behaviour, which is basically doing things to help maintain a stable internal environment. So, a lizard will get into or out of the sun to help it either warm up or cool down. Animals also engage in grooming or preening behaviour. So, they either do it to themselves, like a bird might preen under its wings to help it fly better, which will give it a better chance of surviving. And they can do it to other members of their species. Some primates groom other primates to reduce the incidence of parasites in their fur. Animals also engage in home building behaviour. So they build shelters, which can help protect them from the weather and help them survive. They also engage in territorial behaviour. So this is basically to reduce competition for resources. So if they've got their territory and they can defend that territory well, then they'll have more resources to enable them to survive the best. So obviously you can see that there's a whole bunch of different maintenance behaviours that animals engage in. Now, another type of behaviour that animals engage in is behaviour involving communication. So for example, there's chemical communication, which is basically by the release of pheromones. So for example, an animal might release some pheromones when trying to attract a member of the opposite sex, or to attract a mate. Pheromones only work between members of the same species, so they're really specific chemical messengers of communication. There are also visual signals for communication. So, for example, a bird or a peacock might put up its tail feathers to signal to other peacocks. Animals also use sounds to communicate to each other. The best example of this is basically what I'm doing now. So human speech is a great example of an animal using sound to communicate with another animal. There's also animals communicate via touch. So this could be things like grooming in primates. Or another example would be, when humans pat each other on the back. That's another example of a type of communication by touch. Animals also engage in social behaviour, which involves interactions between members of a group. So a good example of social behaviour is dominance, maybe in a group of primates. So sometimes one male, the alpha male, is dominant over all other members of the group. And so obviously this is good for the alpha male because he gets more access to everything, more access to mate, also more access to food and resources. But it's actually also beneficial to other members of the group because they get protection by being in the group, so it's beneficial for both. Another example of social behaviour is culture or cultural exchange. So that's a type of behaviour. So it basically involves passing information from one generation to the next generation, and this happens certainly in humans, but it also does happen in other animals. So, for example, when lions, the parents of a lion will teach their offspring, the next generation, how to hunt and get prey. And that brings episode 17 of the VCE Biology Podcast to a close. I hope you've learnt lots about animal behaviour. I'm Mr. Barlow, and thanks for listening.